Hello, everyone. It's December 13th, 2022. We're in active BookStream number 1.02 on the book Governing Continuous Transformation. Off to Blue.
Hi, everyone. We are the Active Inference Institute, a participatory online learning institute that is learning, practicing, and thinking about applied active inference. You can reach us here at all of our media links. This is a recorded and an archived live stream, so please provide us with feedback so we can improve upon our work. All backgrounds and perspectives are welcome here, and we will be following good video etiquette for live streams, hopefully. Get in touch if you want to participate either in this book stream or the .0 contextualization streams, or in another live stream, or maybe in the discussion stream. You can reach us always at active.org or by email. Okay, so here we are, BookStream 1.02. The sections will go through the book map and the roadmap, the keywords and the claims, and we'll be continuing the discussion of governing continuous transformation. So I don't know if we want to just maybe mention a couple of things, one or two things that we're excited to discuss more today or learn more about from this section of the book. Tyler, is there anything that stood out for you specifically? Or maybe we want to give an introduction and then maybe say one or two words about the book, the chapter?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Tyler. I work more on the applied side of thinking about governance, organizational design. Both work in like the DAO tooling space and also protocol design. Also works in a lot of like corporate settings or as a strategy consultant. I think for today, what I'm excited about is that, I went to business school, something that I, hear a lot about, like some of these, organizational design frameworks that Bijan references in the book. But it's really interesting to compare that directly to free energy governance and compare, contrast, see where the gaps are. So I'm excited about exploring that more today. What about you, Blue?
I am really excited to kind of link, and so I'll do this right up in the very beginning, but to link what we have talked about in the Active Inference Institute over the last couple of years about biological organization and hierarchical like information flow in biological systems. I'm excited to connect that to how that works in an organization. So I just, as I was reading the book, that was something that stood out to me as something that's maybe necessary for like a more elaborate discussion of the text. Cool. Daniel, anything?
I'll have a comment at the roadmap, but I'm Daniel. I'm a researcher in California and just looking forward to this discussion.
Cool. Thanks. Okay. So here we are at the book map. We are in chapter 2, Sensing, Sensemaking, and Strategic Renewal. And the roadmap for today is just 2 sections. These were structured actually by the author. Strategic Cognition, Sensing and Sensemaking, and the second section is Strategic Renewal. Did you want to make a comment here, Daniel? At the roadmap?
Not yet. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So lots of keywords in today's discussion. So we'll just jump right in, and hopefully we put them in an order that aligns with the order in the book, and included some commentary and claims from the text as well. All right. So Tyler, do you want to read this first part of the abstract?
Sure. Sense and sensemaking form one unitary act, and together can be considered a non-operational cognitive meta-capability or dynamic capability. There's no sensing without sense-making and vice versa, and there's no organizational sense-making in the absence of a clearly defined, deep, existential corporate purpose. Generative processes of top-down, bottom-up hypothesis testing, prediction error minimization, rather than top-down heuristic simplification, are guiding the path navigating a discontinuous world. There's neuroscience's predictive coding that allows us to take management research's strategic cognition, and more specifically, the nexus of structure and cognition, one step further to provide a more complete and practice-relevant framework for applying sensing and sensemaking in the context of strategic renewal. Lou, I'm going to take the next part.
Sure, thanks. Daniel, do you want to read this part? No. Okay, I'll do it. Effectively, sensing and sensemaking are empowered by the circular causality of top-down knowledge structures, prediction models, predictions, hypotheses, and guesses. and bottom-up stimuli data stemming from resource markets. By default, uncertainty and complexity are subjective concepts, but are consistently deployed in management research as objectively determined. Environmental sensing and sensemaking are nonsensical in the absence of having set the firm's purpose and context in the first place. Once we define sensing, sensemaking, and strategic renewal in form of action-centric circular causality linking purpose, prediction models, predictions, and prediction error minimization, a new logic of strategic renewal emerges, dynamically connecting structure, hierarchy, cognition, and capabilities. And so I just really wanted to bring this in here. We're talking here about top down and bottom up. And I know that that's like, there's management styles and structures that are associated with top down and bottom up, like management styles. But I really wanted to bring up this paper, The Information Theory of Individuality by David Krakauer and colleagues at the Santa Fe Institute. And I bring this up because really they try to define what is an individual. So even in a biological system, an individual, like we have more or just as many cells inside of our body that are not human as we do cells that are human, right? But like if you were to take all of those non-human cells out of my body, like I would not be the same person. Like I would not function optimally at all. So I'm more maybe than just what is my DNA. Like there's I'm a colony, right? Not necessarily like I'm one organism, I'm many organisms to function appropriately. And so really these guys tried to define how you like contain an individual, like what is worthy of this Markov blanket. Like we talk about the Markov blanket as the boundary between internal and external, but like where do you put that? Am I drawing it around like my human cells, between my human cells and my non-human cells? Like that doesn't really make sense, right? And so they talk in this paper a lot about, and they do it in a hierarchical way, which is why the biological levels of organization are here, because you can define an individual like at the level of a cell or a tissue or an organism, population, community, and so forth. And this even applies to organizations like a company. So here, what is critical to be defined as an individual is this bidirectional information flow. And I think that this paper is very elegant and great. So you have to have information flowing top down, and you also have to have information flowing bottom up to be like worthy of a Markov blanket and considered an individual in this paper. And so I really just kind of wanted to bring that in because they talk about it. Bijan talks a lot about how you need this bottom up and top down, and they have to work together. And he talks about that a lot in the book for a firm to persist. And so like really it's necessary for anything to persist. Like you have to have that bidirectional information flow to earn your Markov blanket, so to speak. So I just wanted to kind of bring that up here before we jump in to the additional context talking about top down and bottom up in the book. Did you guys have any comments here? Daniel?
Yeah, what I was going to suggest that the roadmap was a quote from the abstract, Subjective Concepts Pragmatically Applied, which I think deals with a lot of informational concepts. And then, like you brought up, if you define self spatially or genetically, you're going to get some boundaries, which may be relevant in certain situations, but also might give a misleading or partial view of the total system. And then the challenge is when we move to this informational or statistical theory of nested selves, then organizations and their niches can have many different looking causes and components. So it's very challenging, and it's not the org chart. It's not the computer access chart. It's something that's somehow different. And I think that'll be relevant to pull out what is being described and what should people's consideration be. What do we actually gain by saying that systems are nested, which isn't a novel insight?
Yeah, that's great. And then like also, in talking about that, like, bidirectional information flow, like there's a certain amount of salience that has to be there also. Like information can be flowing both directions, but if the information is irrelevant, then that's going to, not be the cause for perseverance, right? Okay, cool. Okay, so here we are. Strategic cognition, sensing, and sensemaking, and just an early quote from this chapter. Do you want to read this, Tyler? Is that okay?
All right. Strategy initiation and formulation, defined as a complex activity consisting of scanning, sense making, and strategic decision making, are at the heart of the firm's collective interpretive power, emphasizing its core capabilities, timely and accurate reading of expected environmental change, and the corresponding need for resource reconfiguration and pursuit of adaptation.
Cool, thank you. Okay, so strategic cognition, they used the definition presented in this paper, the cognitive perspective in strategy and integrated review, and they reference this paper quite a bit. So I just pulled out this diagram of strategic cognition and pulled up the definition that was used in this paper. So they say strategic cognition is discussed in terms of its constituents: structure and process. By structure, we refer to the relatively stable characteristics and repeated patterns of behavior, and by process, to the cognitive activities taking place in organizations.
Just a note on that, the focus in this book is on kind of a certain type of corporation with a board of directors, for example, which is an important category. This, I'm also just imagining someone who is navigating spatially as part of like working in a taxi service. Also, strategic cognition is coming into play, though the wording might be framed a little differently. But it's similar questions about sense making and just different implementations of different kinds of organizations.
And I wonder how like strategy in terms of this kind of strategic cognition is related to like the systems engineering approach. Is it like aligned with that or maybe not? That's something that'd be interesting to know more about. Do you have any comments here, Tyler?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually something that, to build on Daniel's point, like how specific what Bijan is talking about is to boards specifically versus other organizational structures. And just like a comment on that, my initial feelings on so far where we are in the book is that it's really not, and I'm not seeing why we need to reduce the scope to just like organizations that have boards, especially since like most of the companies I've been in, a lot of the important decision making is really happening at the level of really more at the executives in the C-suite. And Bijan might argue like, hey, that's actually a problem. It should be more coming from an active board. But it's kind of interesting to see like where are the limits of what Bijan is talking about and how specific is it to a specific kind of organizational structure.
Or another angle is in the body, the decisions are being made in a distributed, nested way. And so that kind of organization, I think we'll read on to find, will have resonance with this. However, who should the strategic communication and cutting edge research on the strategy, governance, upstream decision making, there's a very certain audience I think it makes sense to communicate that to. And also this is the threads being linked for a first time in a dissertation style book. And I could imagine different kinds of presentations and implementations being presented differently, not necessarily like an academic published dissertation.
And that leads me to wonder, perhaps strategic cognition can take place at many levels in a hierarchical system. Like maybe, an individual, like a project or a team is doing strategic cognition on the execution of their goals and tasks. And that happens, at the level of the individual and the team and the project and the, department and then the firm and then the board. So perhaps it occurs in several places.
So like when I've been reading board, when Bijan says board, I read that as like council. And that's my like interpretation of that. And that can happen at many levels as well.
Funny, like when you say counsel, I think attorney, like why do we have lawyers involved?
I mean, counsel is in like high council, supreme council.
All right, awesome. Okay, so sensing, I pulled this out to Tyler's, protests. I wanted to just maybe talk a little bit about sensing and sense making, and talk a little bit about them separately. But they are sensing and sensing and sense making form one unitary act, and together can be considered a non-operational cognitive meta capability or dynamic capability. And this reminds me of the time that I asked Carl about like when I'm sensing, what am I sensing? Like, am I sensing, like, when I look at a red balloon, am I sensing red balloon, or am I sensing like 700 nanometer wavelength of light and like round oval shape? Like, what is actually being perceived via the senses? And so, like, there is actually, and Carl answered me, he said red balloon, like, go away from the red light and go more toward the red balloon. And so, like, that answer really said, like, okay, there actually is not sensing without sense making. Like, they are inextricably linked, because if I'm actually sensing red balloon, like, then I'm actually, like, I'm going beyond what, like, my eyes see, or like what my nose smells, or whatever. Okay, and effectively, sensing and sense making is a form of organizational learning, action-centric hypothesis testing that connects the individual level with that of the firm. Do you guys have any comments here? Or we can move on to sense making, or stay in sense making, maybe. All right, Tyler, this is yours.
All right, sense making. So purpose, goal directedness. So the world's models, underlying prediction model, is fundamental to sensing and sense making. So dissonance is a function of a preset goal, generating predictions and submitting those predictions to continuous error minimization. Sense making models are constantly adjusted through error and deviation querying feedback loops, coupling top-down predictions and bottom-up stimuli and circular causality with the sole objective in minimizing prediction errors and surprise, i.e. free energy. Fundamentally, sense-making is about designing noticing systems. And so a quote that I really liked from the paper that is actually from Wake, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, is sense making is about how people deal with situations where there are too many or too few meanings. And this is something that I've experienced a lot, especially in like startup contexts. Like, you could think of it, they're actually kind of the same situation, too many or too few meanings. Like, if you're in a startup and you're trying to figure out what you do next, like, your strategic directions are like kind of infinite because you haven't really built that many. So like, there's like all these directions you can go, things you're hearing in the ecosystem, like, oh, what if we did this? What if we did this? And like, that all could be meaningful, but at the same time, it all collapses into like, what are we actually doing? Like, are we even building anything right now? Like, what's the point of any of this? And so a lot of how that kind of shows up in your, like, for example, in a health context, that would show up in the body as kind of like illness or this feeling of agitation and anxiety. And you kind of have that same embodied feeling both in yourself and in the organization of like, hey, like, what we're doing isn't working. We're having all of these like communication kind of issues where like there are breakdowns where you're not receiving what I'm telling you, the information I'm telling you about the problem isn't being received correctly and acted upon. And it basically like boils up into becoming a bigger issue to where something needs to happen and some action needs to be taken. And so it's really like this social process, not something that's like the CEO being like, wow, like, let me like go in here and like figure out the root issue like a plumber would, and then like tell the organization what happened. But it's more of this kind of like feeling of agitation that happens throughout the organization and through the social process, being like, what is going on? What are we doing? People getting increasingly flustered. Something is birthed in that process. And something that I actually had like a personal realization when I was reading this chapter, because I used to work as a strategy consultant. And strategy consultant, what I kind of realized about that job is that it's purely about sense making. So a lot of times people think of strategy consultants as like, oh, you're doing like a complicated quantitative analysis. You give that to the board of directors. They make a decision, super top down. But actually where we spent most of our time on was socialization, like kind of talking to people, like kind of knowing when we went into the organization, like roughly what was going on in a certain way. We would collect data, kept talking to people, but even when we were pretty sure we had the answer, most of the job was actually framing and communication and like talking to a bunch of people and using the language that they use and making sure that there's a shared narrative between everyone. And so like that was where the real work is. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like management consultants are professional sense makers. And I think a lot of times, a lot of organizations are actually embedding management consultants within the organization as a way of like sense making as like a capability that an organization would have. And so like an example of something I had as a management consultant where you kind of feel this dissonance was like, I worked for a lot of like health insurance companies. And so health insurance companies were having this problem where, well, at least in the US, skyrocketing healthcare costs. And if you're a health insurance company, you're basically a payment processor. And so you don't really have any levers to fix that. And so there's this issue of like, okay, well, we need to rein in costs, but like we don't have any levers to do that. And so what that means is that you have to become more of a care manager to some extent. And like that is a totally different way of like contextualizing like who you are, both on the organization level and on the individual level of like, what is my purpose here in this role, in this organization? What's this organization trying to do? And getting to the care management side, like totally needs to shift that. And so that shows up in the organization as like a lot of dissonance, a lot of angst, and also like a lot of pain. And it ends up meaning that both the organization needs to change, but also this individual needs to change themselves and how they relate to that organization. And so that's why I like this cartoon of like, I've been restructured. It's like, a lot of times it's like you have to recontextualize yourself while also the organization is recontextualizing like what it's trying to do. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Daniel and Blue, do you have anything to add on the slide?
Well, that's very insightful. And it reminds me of the two ways that the entities can reduce free energy by changing their mind and changing the world through action. And this is an approach where we can describe that process happening at multiple nested and interacted levels. And even if the niche changed around one, the world would be different. The regime of attention would be different. The action perception loop would be different. And that would at the very least induce anxiety and uncertainty cognitively. So it's really interesting what you added.
And I just love your cartoon that you pulled out. It's good. Okay. So here is a claim from the book, from the chapter. On a more operational level, sense-making's very effectiveness is shaped by three critical dimensions. First, the clarity of a timeless corporate purpose. Second, a dissonance-centric quest for and optimization of filtering anomalies. As anomalies become shared, sensibleness should become stronger. And C, an enactivist worldview, i.e., environment is not exogenously predetermined, but is enacted through the social and action-centric construction of shared meaning. And so, like, let's talk about dissonance a little bit. Just going back to this quote, unless you guys have comments here. No, okay. So fundamentally, firm-level sensing and sense-making, grounded in dissonance theory, are a social process rather than a singular activity dedicated to detecting anomalies. And I think that this goes back to what Tyler was actually just talking about. But I looked up like the theory, and this is the citation that Bijan used. And in this text, Festinger says, in short, I'm proposing that dissonance, that is the existence of non-fitting relations among cognitions, is a motivating factor in its own right. By the term cognition here and in the remainder of the book, I mean any knowledge, opinion, or belief about the environment, oneself, or one's behavior. Cognitive dissonance can be seen as an antecedent condition which leads to activity oriented toward dissonance reduction, just as hunger leads to activity oriented toward hunger reduction. It is a very different motivation from what psychologists are used to dealing with, but as we shall see, nonetheless powerful. And so when we talk about sensing and sense-making being grounded in dissonance theory, this was something Tyler and I had discussed offline, back channel. We were talking about dissonance theory, and what we're interpreting this to mean here is that it is this like disjoint activity, like a mismatch between maybe like individual and firm level cognition, or firm level cognition and like societal expectations, or anyway, like there's a gap that causes like a kind of discomfort that needs to then be filled. But I would be excited to hear maybe Bijan talk more about how it's grounded in dissonance theory, just because it was kind of unclear from the text, like what exactly that might mean. But if you guys have any comments here, Daniel?
Yeah. In active inference, we might think about dissonance as being related to a divergence, like a KL divergence. And so dissonance isn't a state of exception and kind of a binary switch. There's always some non-zero level of divergence between expectations and incoming sensory data, if only because the generative model is coarse-grained. So in the decimal points, the world always is going to be somewhat surprising, or at least evaluatable in terms of surprise. So again, instead of centering, for example, absolute value attainment, and then seeing uncertainty as a secondary characteristic, we use divergence-based statistics to incorporate this idea of dissonance or divergence-driven behavior and put that at the center of the imperative for action.
Yeah, I interpreted Bijan's bringing up dissonance theory as like way of bridging both the individual cognition to like the social cognition, and like how the feeling of anxiety manifests in an organization. And so like, I think dissonance theory, at least in this quote, might be referring to the individual specifically, and how that individual, but anxiety of like, hey, I thought I was going to get a promotion this year. I didn't get a promotion this year. Something is wrong. Or like, hey, I worked really hard on this feature. It didn't increase conversions in the way I thought it would. That feels bad. That's not motivating for me, right? So that's like on the individual level, but then there's another way you can interpret that dissonance on a more of like a social level as a way, and like more of a social cognition.
Cool. All right. Non-uniformity. Tyler?
All right. All right. It's critical that the environment throughput, listening to what wants to emerge, is neither logic nor goal trapped, but open to non-uniformity. In fact, the throughput of non-uniformity is a measure of firm survivability. Uncertainty and surprise are not to be avoided, but to be minimized through action and hypothesis testing-centric engagement with the world, as the underlying world model consequently and generatively gains an informational edge. And so we talked about this a little bit during the last book stream, but a lot of leaders want to imagine that they're like slowly ironing out non-uniformity, and that like you're creating this perfect organizational design. And it's actually kind of funny, like there's this trap that a lot of leaders get into, and I've actually gone into this myself, where like it's kind of like utopia design almost. Actually, it's exactly the same thing as utopia design, where you're like, I'm gonna have this model of like where I'm gonna like all these problems I perceive in the world, like I'm just gonna fix by just like top down, just like God mode, figuring it out. And then like everything is going to be there. And like, we're not going to have to worry about anything anymore. It's going to be great. And then like invariably, like your 2 weeks, you create a new org design, 2 weeks, and it works for like a week and people are excited about it. And then like you start seeing kind of ruffles at the edge, you start like trying to patch things up, and then it like all disintegrates. And then like, I think a lot of leaders are like, oh, well, like, you know, we have the wrong people. People aren't, you know, following process like I want them to, right? And it gets really frustrating. But I think even when it goes well, it's just like you were missing out on kind of like how generative that non-uniformity can be, and where basically like if people are too rigid in their process, you're not carving out space for anything new. And so like, the way that Bijan talks about non-uniformity in this case is that you minimize it through kind of action-oriented hypothesis testing. You're not like wallowing in this uncertainty. There's a way that you can capture that and take ownership over uncertainty and use it for something that's really like beautiful and productive. And so like, for example, you know, I've had jobs where I was like a product analyst, and I worked for this like consumer logistics company where we like go into people's homes and like pack up all of their things. So it's like a very, very complicated job, right? And so we would like figure things out like, okay, wow, our times for this kind of job in this city are going up a lot. And we would see that in the data, and we're like, wow, this is really inefficient. And then we would like, that manifest itself as like some kind of anxiety or dissonance. And then we would like start, we do analysis and we feel like, oh, it's this kind of job, it's this kind of job with this kind of furniture. Then you like talk to some of these movers, and you find out, oh, they don't have the right equipment on this. They don't have like this kind of wrench on these particular jobs. And you're like, that's interesting. Then you socialize that information, figure out from operations that wrench isn't consistently being returned, and they're actually losing a lot of their equipment to be able to do that job. Then you find out like, from other operational leaders that they're not being funded appropriately. They don't have like discretional spending to be able to like actually pay for that kind of equipment, right? So it's like through that anxiety, you kind of like are action oriented and can figure out like, hey, like this is not something that the situation isn't totally screwed. Like we can actually keep moving forward and like testing, figuring out like what's going on and taking action accordingly.
It makes me think of pain and soreness and redness in the body. Like signals have to propagate in order for things to change, and that could be in an allostatic or an anticipatory or in a reactive or in a traumatized way from the organism's perspective. But the only way that we're going to find out about it is through this kind of like active perception, individuals or nested levels above them making an action-oriented decision to like sense out different information and control attention, which is actually seen as a policy selection over cognitive states.
Sorry, my mouse was sticky. I am also reminded of biological systems, but maybe for a different reason. So in biology, non-uniformity is critical to existence. Like you have a system at equilibrium in a biological system, that's death. So this non-uniformity, and I think he even brings it up like as critical. I don't know if I quoted it here, but he brings it up as critical to survival. You have to have non-uniformity. If everything's the same, it's like dull, bored. Like it's so important to have variety. Variety is the spice of life, right? Okay, cool. All right, purpose. So purpose and goal directedness, i.e. the world model's underlying prediction model, is fundamental to sensing and sense making. And like this is the world model's underlying model. So I just wanted to point that out, that there's some nestedness going on here. Dissonance is a function of a preset goal, generating predictions and submitting those predictions to continuous error minimization. Environmental sensing and sense making are nonsensical in the absence of having set the firm's existential purpose in the first place. Purpose, not strategy, is the reason an organization exists. Its definition and articulation must be top management's first responsibility. And this reminds me of our like management organization in the Active Inference Institute. Like, what is the purpose of the Institute? And just trying to kind of outline and highlight these key things. Like we can't have a strategy without having a goal to like what is that strategy trying to achieve? What is the point, right? If you guys have comments here too, that'd be awesome.
Just that, is this meant to be a sentence in one language or another language, even in the same language or a formal language? It will mean different things to different people. It'll be associated with different envelopes and portfolios of risk and positive or negative consequences, also deemed positive and negative by a different worldview and contingent upon all these unknown unknowns. So I think amidst that is where we can explore a lot of interesting experiences, I'm sure, and what has worked and what hasn't worked in the applied settings, and then also start to synthesize it with the research on cognitive science and organizational cognition. And that's, I think, what this book is about, like moving beyond just recognizing that complexity and starting to apply active inference and propose free energy governance as an approach to step in here and be useful as well as grounded.
Yeah, just to add on that, like, I think I'm curious if Bijan ever gets to a point in the book where he really gives some guidelines for thinking through how to design purpose more explicitly. Because generally this is done extremely poorly, even in like major corporations where they're like, our purpose is like bringing smiles to our consumers or something just like super vague, ambiguous that like actually doesn't really help you at all. It's more of actually like a branding exercise. And more of like a corporate social responsibility, maybe not really anything about like purpose. And when purpose is done well, it's really more like, you guys might disagree with this definition, but like I think it's kind of more like a heuristic. It's like a decision rule of like, we do this and not this. And it's a way of collapsing information and just being like, let's not think through everything we could possibly be doing right now. Like, we already decided this is what we're doing. And it's a way to not think about things too. And so I found this to be especially important in like decentralized contexts as well. And I think this is kind of what free energy governance is getting towards, is like where you have more bottoms up stimuli that you're processing and changing, like these top down models. And it's really important in that context because you can't be managing everybody like really intensely. It's like, this is exactly what you have to do, but rather you have to give a decision rule that a decentralized group of people can use independently. So especially as we get into more like a free energy governance kind of world, like purpose is super important, but like Daniel touched on, like it's not always totally clear what like a good purpose even looks like. And I hope John has a very crisp answer later on for what good purpose is.
So like here I am, like the non-business person. And Tyler, you said you don't read like business books, but like I've read more than I like ever wanted to read. It just in like my own little startup side venture. But I read Jim Collins' Good to Great book, and he really talks about like purpose is really as defining what you do and what you don't do. And he really, I mean, it kind of affronted me. I like he talks about the fox versus the hedgehog. Like, you know, that the fox does lots of things very well. He's very like clever and can do many things. And the hedgehog like only has one thing. They do one thing. Like that's it. They roll up into a ball, right? Like that's all a hedgehog ever does. And so like in this fox hedgehog analogy, like as a company, he says, you want to be a hedgehog. And I'm like, but I want to do so many different things. but really that having, especially like when I think about a decentralized thing, like we do one thing. Like, I don't know, he talked about like many different companies, but like, you know, Wells Fargo as a bank was a good example. Like we are creating the best bank in the United States of America. We're never banking outside. And like maybe it started regionally and expanded a little bit, or even Southwest. We are only going to fly in the Southwest. Like they just defined one thing that they were good at, that they could just be better than everybody else at, and just ran with that. And that is kind of like one of the defining factors of a great company in his view.
Yeah, it's actually, to build on that a little bit, like it's been a long time since I read Good to Great, but Jim Collins is kind of like the prototypical like top down, or what some would call like orange style of management, where it's very achievement oriented. It's very much about like the CEO as being the hero, forcing their way and like telling the organization what to do and focusing everybody really intensely. And so when you talk about the fox and the hedgehog, like it's interesting. He says you want to be the hedgehog, because usually when I hear people talk about the fox and the hedgehog, it's like you don't want to be the hedgehog, like forcing everything into your narrow world model. And so I think when he says be the hedgehog, it's really coming from this top-down perspective, and it's really not getting into like the free energy governance model of like where like ideally you want to be both the fox and the hedgehog, where like you really want to have a unified world model that you're like, hey, this world model is like not true, by the way. Like we all know that this is subject to change, and we're going to be like actively changing this, but like we all have to be on the same page. And so we're going to have this somewhat arbitrary belief of what our purpose is, that we're going to continuously evolve over time in a fox-like manner. And so it's like, that's a really hard thing to communicate. And it's like very subtle. And I've tried to communicate this in the past, often ineffectively. And so, yeah, I'm really curious if there's like ways to, you know, better combine that fox and hedgehog, you know, model.
So like totally, now we're spinning out on a tangent, but I just have to say, like, I don't know, like, I get the whole fox thing. Like I am very much like aligned mentally with how like a fox type of behavior, like, because I'm just like, oh, squirrel, like let me go chase that. But the hedgehog thing, like I was thinking like, okay, do you really want to be a fox and a hedgehog, or do you want to be like multiple hedgehogs? Like I had this like vision of like dropping water on the hedgehog, like the little gremlins, you know, and you drop the water and then they multiply, and then you have like, you know, a little field of hedgehogs that are all like doing many different things in a very great way, but all siloed, and you know, they're one little thing. Okay, we have to go on, or we can talk about gremlins all day long.
Cool. So for heuristics, I mean, this actually fits into purpose, because you could think of purpose like as a heuristic, and I'm not sure if John would agree with that, but that's how I think about it. And so read at least a few. His definition was, you know, cognitive heuristics are a form of cognitive simplification or rules of thumb and tools that empower the human mind with what the poet John Keats called negative capability, the ability to survive and thrive. in uncertainty. And so, yeah, there's just a way of like collapsing information overload and finding a way forward despite like not having the ability to process everything at the same time. But then, Bijan goes on later to say that heuristics are fundamentally anchored in a worldview of environmental adaptation rather than enactment. So, i.e., resolving uncertainty is rather treated as a matter of adaptation to an exogenously determined game. This book rejects environmental adaptation as a viable survival strategy in a perpetually discontinuous one-shot interactions environment. And so, to just like illustrate this a little bit, so that obviously I think we could all understand like a heuristic may not be very good, and you could use the wrong heuristic, and but just like to make this more concrete about like how heuristics can be confusing, is that here are like two like really common heuristics for financial planning, especially in the context of startups. So one is called Default Alive, and this was from Paul Graham. He's the founder of Y Combinator. And so he says, okay, a company should cut costs such that if you assume constant revenue growth, the company is going to make it a profitability with the money it has left. And so like that totally makes sense, especially in a startup context where like extreme uncertainty. But then there's like another decision rule, which is more about expected value. So a company should choose the financial decision with the highest expected value, expected payoff of outcome X, or of outcome times the likelihood of the outcome. And so these aren't like necessarily incompatible. Well, like they can be complementary to each other, but they could tell you to do very different things. Especially if like an expected value of like, hey, we can crater the business right now is like a 10% likelihood, but we can also have, or a 90% likelihood, but 10% likelihood we make a $100 billion company, right? And so like that would lead you to do a different thing than Default Alive. And so a lot of times business leaders are like juggling both of these at the same time and not necessarily like realizing that they are contradictory heuristics and that there are limits to their heuristics. So yeah, I'll leave it there. I think actually a couple other things that he says too are that like, simple heuristics can outperform more complicated ones as well. And it's like actually not even clear on an organizational level how effective heuristics are, because a lot of times when they do studies on heuristics, it's with individuals where there are not other intelligent actors who are making anticipations about your strategy. Whereas in like a business setting, there are. And so to take like a very simple example of this, like with design, for a long time was this movement of like the heuristic for design was like, oh, everything needs to be super legible and clean. And like you would use like Helvetica 16-point font, like really like we want this to be clear and we want information hierarchy, and like that matters far and above everything else. But then the problem is that everyone was doing that and it got really monotonous. And so the actual optimal strategy in that case was to design something totally wacky and insane. And so over the last 3 years, there was like this, especially with the Web3, just like absurd, like looked like they were like GeoCities pages from the 90s, where it was like looked awful and it was like not accessible and it was gross, but it was really interesting to look at. And they were using fonts that were totally unreadable, but it was interesting. And it was this competitive situation where like the obvious heuristic, but in a competitive situation, made the optimal strategy doing the opposite of that heuristic.
Oh, just a few notes. There's so many great points. One is the game theory L-for-roll bar problem, where there's a bar and you want to go if it's under half full, but not over half full. It's not fun. You can't get a drink. And it turns out that that's like an unwinnable game, because if you go, well, if it was busy yesterday or if it was busy 3 nights ago, all decision rules, if you just hold to them, get adapted around. And I think then that's a very interesting light to reject environmental adaptation as a strategy position of the book, because I think adapting to the environment sounds like something biological. It sounds like something that would be successful organizationally. And then I think that will also lead us to some discussions of how does the free energy minimization imperative transcend the default alive expected value dialectic.
VUCA.
All right. VUCA. So this is an acronym for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Sorry for some background noise right now, by the way. So I'm just read a quote. This is actually a full disclosure from my aunt, who's a leadership and organizational design consultant. She wrote this post called Intrepid Explorers in VUCA Territory, and I really liked how she framed this, where most of us in the West were trained in the professional model that prize expertise. Today, being an expert and a specialist is not enough. And worse, it can make you part of the problem, because today we are dealing with the frontiers of humanity, a place where no one has been and no one could possibly be a content expert. And so what I really, really like about this is that we're entering this world that is increasingly volatile, increasingly ambiguous, but at the same time that really runs up against how we're individually motivated as professionals, where a lot of us really want to get good at a thing and have mastery. And it really requires handling this uncertainty, the complexity, that volatility is a personal discipline as well as an organizational discipline. As far as that personal resilience and handling that uncertainty and complexity is what is going to make the organization resilient. And that's actually quite hard to build. And it's a very rare skill set. And a lot of it's about, and I really like how this graph framed this of how well can you predict your actions and how much do you know about the situation? And on both of those axes, it's becoming increasingly so that you know very little about the situation. You really can't predict your actions, and the ability for expertise to really navigate through that is much less effective, and it's much more about cross-functional collaboration. And Daniel and Blue, did you want to take anything on that? Cool.
Okay, I'm going to read this claim from the book. Generative processes of top-down, bottom-up hypothesis testing, i.e. prediction error minimization, rather than top-down, rule-based simplification, are guiding the path to navigating a discontinuous world. I'm just going to read these yellow parts. In fact, heuristics rather tame uncertainty. Heuristics reinforce dominant logics in the form of pattern recognition and tend to disregard dissonant bottom-up stimuli as noise. In fact, heuristics may reinforce the phenomenon of deliberate ignorance and tame curiosity's information-enriching drive as a foundation for prediction error minimization. I really liked this quote from the book and thought that it kind of maybe sums up the argument against heuristics and also this top-down, bottom-up circular causality that we've been discussing through the chapter. Daniel?
A little bit uncertain about heuristics for information enrichment and epistemic drive. Can that be a heuristic? If so, would that close the loop?
So that's the reward function. I mean, we've had this discussion many times, the epistemic and pragmatic value. When you knock out one side of the equation, what do you have left? And so yeah, can your heuristic merely be info sampling? I think that's probably fair, but yeah. A subtle technical detail, probably. Tyler, cognitive maps?
All right. Cognitive maps are closely related to heuristics and can be considered the potent form of visualizing sense-making in form of graphic representations that locate people in relation to their information environments. Maps provide a frame of reference for what is known and what is believed. So, I've actually made a lot of cognitive maps myself on various consulting projects. And what's kind of funny about cognitive maps is that they're actually really useful to make as the person who is making them. As you go through the process of making a cognitive map, you can feel I understand the complexity of this organization pretty well at this point, and I can actually hold it all in my mind at one time. But the problem with that is that there's two problems. One is that no one understands your cognitive map at all. It's only useful to you. And then the other problem is that it basically immediately becomes outdated and does not reflect how the organization actually works. And so even a month, 2 months later, it's completely useless, even to yourself. And Bijan has a good quote of this where he really says that this cognitive map isn't really useful for the purposes of free energy governance. And so he says cognitive mapping is representative of the deterministic view of the world akin to a physical cause and effect chain, and should be considered rather anti-clocked in the face of discontinuous market environments. So yeah, it's really not something that you're going to be able to fully map out how governance works or how an organization works. This is actually something that I'm thinking a lot about for the past couple of months in the context of DAOs of like, can you model the flow of value and power completely within an organization as code? And I think what Bijan would say is probably not. If you can't, it's not fully like this deterministic model of cause and effects. It's really something more of a social process that's a little bit more ambiguous and fluffy and hard to nail down. Daniel, Blue, you have anything to add here?
So like on the one hand, I don't know, like cognitive maps, like when I was taught about them in college, they made no sense to me. I hated them. I was like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. But then like when you get into process flow, like in writing code and in like system design, they kind of like make sense, like an experimental design chart. So I don't know, I'm back and forth on the, can you read your own cognitive map? Sometimes. Like if you can't, I would argue that if you can't read your own cognitive map, that it's not a good one. How about that?
Yeah.
Okay. Claim. Okay. It is neuroscience's predictive coding that allows us to take management research's sense-making perspective, as well as nexus of structure and cognition, one step further to provide a more complete and relevant framework for applying sensing and sense-making in the context of strategic renewal. Effectively, sensing and sense-making are empowered by the circular causality between top-down knowledge structures, prediction models, predictions, hypotheses, and guesses, and bottom-up stimuli data stemming from resource markets. I just thought it was important to include this claim here. I feel like it sums up a lot of what is written in this chapter. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about abductive reasoning. And this picture on the left shows like inductive reasoning, which is like when you have a specific observation, you come to a general conclusion about that specific observation. Like if you see, you know, 3 men wearing white shirts in a room, and then you might say like, oh, all the men wear white shirts, but it might just be a coincidence, right? And then like deductive reasoning, where you have a general rule and you come to a specific conclusion, like, you know, all the men have to be wearing white shirts in this situation. And so you conclude that the men in this room will be wearing white shirts. So that's like a deductive reasoning. And then you have this abductive reasoning, like where you have this incomplete observation, where you see like some of the men in the room wearing white shirts and you don't know anything about the rules, right? And so like you have this incomplete observation and you make your best prediction. Like, oh, I guess some percentage of the men here like to wear white or something like that. So this incomplete observation coming to this best prediction. I probably did a horrible job at specific examples, but those were just like, sorry, off the top of my head. So that's like this reasoning logic. And a quote from the text: abductive reasoning usually begins with a surprising observation or experience. This is what shatters our habit and motivates us to create a hypothesis that might resolve the anomaly. Abduction is an inferential procedure in which we create a conjecture that, if it were, would make the surprising anomaly part of our normal understanding of the world. So I liked this idea of linking abduction to surprise. And I just wanted to point out the live stream number 47 about active inference and abduction. And we discussed more than one paper in this live stream. So just to read a quick quote from this specific paper. This paper, it's Pietarainen, I probably butchered that, and Majid Beni. And I think Majid was on that stream with us. And this paper says, the focus is on the allegiance between the nomenclatures of active and abductive inferences as the proper place to begin reaching at the wider target. The paper outlines key conceptual elements involved in a naturalistic rendering of Peirce's late semiotic and logical notion of abductive reasoning, and targeting a cognitive biological model of abduction, which preserves the functional integrity of an organism and fulfills the existential imperative for living beings' evidence of existence. And this paper was awesome, like totally mind-blowing, and I can't do it justice in like, the 5 minutes or whatever time we have here. So if you want to learn more about abduction and the relationship to active inference, I suggest go check out this live stream or read this paper. Unless you guys have comments here. we can move on forward.
Yeah, just one comment on that is that like I found it really challenging often to like in an organizational context to toggle between inductive, deductive, and abductive reasoning, where it's like a lot of times people get confused which kind of reasoning you're actually using. And if you do something that is kind of more abductive, like, hey, like, here's what I'm seeing, here's my best guess, like throwing things at the wall, like then you get trapped into these things. Well, like, well, how do you really know that's true? And you're like, yeah, like that's the point. Like I don't know that's true. But like we're like really just trying to like this is a creative act we're doing together of like trying to come up with some hypothesis. I've just like this is a really specialized skill set and it's like quite hard. So yeah.
And funny in the book, I don't think we pulled this quote out. I almost did, but I was like, I'll leave it be. But like Bijan, I don't know if he's quoting someone else or he just says like, you know, abductive reasoning is like any hypothesis is good enough. Like whatever, like so it's just kind of like, you know, I don't know, shooting arrows in the dark. It kind of made it sound like that, but there actually can be quite a bit of art and science to abductive reasoning. Okay.
Cool. So Bijan lays out a few different frameworks for thinking about collective sense making, and specifically like how you connect different levels of the hierarchy together, like sense making at one at the individual, and like, you know, leveling that up through organizational sense making. And so he talks about these like 6 different models of collective sense making, and he wasn't necessarily saying like, hey, I am fully behind each one of these, but he's more just talking about like prior work and how to think about like the gaps and how they line up to free energy governance. So let's go through each one of them. All right, the 4I model. So the 4I models, this is the intuiting, interpreting, integrating, and institutionalizing. And so this is really thinking about how sense making flows through the individual level and then bubbles up through different levels of socialization up into institutionalization. So Crossan's 4I model, intuiting, interpreting, integrating, and institutionalizing as applied to the context of strategic renewal, provides a framework for the process of transmorphing individual sensing and sense-making cognition to firm-level strategic action. Intuiting and interpreting a hypothesis starts at the individual level, and subsequently the interpretation, sense-making process becomes socialized, integrated, and institutionalized at the firm level. And so this whole process is goal-directed. It's not just taking, you know, bottoms-up stimuli and then somehow magically transforming it into institutional processes. It is really goal-directed and hypothesis-driven of really inactive and saying, hey, this is what we believe about the world, and seeing it is actually the case. And I think Bijan has an interesting point about this 4I model that like a lot of times organizations really don't view themselves as being active creators of their world, are really, especially when you context of like the board, views themselves as more passive receptacles of information. And so this whole process of sense making from the individual level to the organizational level is really like an active process driven, especially driven by the board. Blue or Daniel, do you have anything to add here? All right, tension-based view. So tension-based view, this is another model that is similarly connecting both the individual level of cognition to the institutional level. It just has like a different spin on it and different emphasis. And so in this model, the idea is that you need attention to make decisions, right? Like you need to put some focus and energy to make a decision, but individuals and consequently firms have limited attention, right? So like this is just like this fundamental constraint on your ability to make decisions, is that you just don't have the time or energy to devote to every single decision. And so, you know, your individual cognition is constrained, and because your individual cognition is constrained, so is your social cognition. And like that social cognition is shaped by different factors. That is like social factors, cultural factors, economic factors. And that social cognition, those forces that shape like situational contexts that shape your social cognition, those manifest and are institutionalized in the organizational cognition. And that is like rules, the positions, the players, and the resources. So if you guys are familiar with like Eleanor Ostrom's model of like thinking about kind of how common resource organizations develop, it's kind of like the same exact framework that she uses. So this is very consistent with free energy governance, though it doesn't really capture like that inactive process of reality construction. It's much more about just like thinking about attention and how that bubbles up through different levels of the hierarchy. Blue, Daniel, anything out here? All right, dynamic capability view. So the aim of dynamic capabilities research is ambitious to understand how firms can sustain a competitive advantage by responding to and creating environmental change. This is from Helpat, who is one of the main proponents of this type of dynamic capability view. They also go on to say that dynamic capabilities are the capacity of an organization to purposefully create, extend, and modify its resource base. So this is like very consistent with like how I learned about organizational design and evolution in like a business school. Is much more about like, hey, we have these kinds of resources, kind of like a Settlers of Catan model. Almost like we have these resources and these constraints in our environment, and this is like how we can extend that resource base and grow over time. And it has a little bit more like a deterministic bent to it. And it's about like how you survive in a quickly changing environment. So in that sense, it's like similar to free energy governance, but it's really more about like strategic change. It's not really about like the individual cognition. Like it doesn't really talk much about individual cognition at all. So it's like missing, it's like an interesting like theoretical framework, but it's not really as embodied as free energy governance, and as like it's missing that relationship to the individual. Blue, Daniel, anything to add here? All right, OKRs. So OKRs are objectives and key results. So like the idea here is that you have a main, so at every single level of the hierarchy. So let's say that your company, top level of the hierarchy is like, actually we'll just use this example on the slide. You're the head of the brand, you want to get 1,000 new signups, right? That is your objective. Or your objective is increasing brand activations, and the key result, like the quantitative way you measure that, is get 1,000 new signups, right? So that's at the top level of the organization. And then in each level of the hierarchy below that, you have like the subcomponents that would need to be true to get 1,000 new signups, right? So the things that would need to be true to get 1,000 new signups are that, well, one, you have to, on the head of content, you have to get your click-through rate above some threshold, implement 10, 12 new mediums to post old or new content. On the partnership side, you have to get 10,000 event registrants by some date, right? Sorry. So it's basically a way of thinking about like how goals cascade from the top level of the organization and filter down through the other levels. Jesus Christ. Sorry about that. Very persistent. And so this is actually really popular in especially like the tech world. This is pioneered by like John Doerr and Larry Page wrote this book about called Measure What Matters. And it's about like a quantitative way of thinking about organizational design and goal setting. And so I've actually done this a lot at different organizations, and it can be powerful. And I think Bijan really likes it. He says OKRs have proven to be an invaluable and dynamic tool to foster informal exchanges at the field level of resource markets, approximating self-organization, because each level of the hierarchy has the responsibility for themselves to set their own OKR that aligns with the next level of the hierarchy, right? So it can be like really dynamic and have that self-organizing quality. However, a problem with it, and this is not something that Bijan brought up, but this is just something from my own experience, is that like, especially in a startup context, things are moving so quickly that OKRs very, very often become outdated pretty much like immediately. And so you'll set an OKR for a quarter, and then you're a month down the line, and so much has changed. Like the context is so different that like this OKR obviously doesn't matter anymore. And that's like a huge problem. And so like you need some way of like changing your OKRs dynamically. But the problem is that OKRs take a lot of work to set up and to socialize and to measure. And so then you really don't have the resources necessarily to do that. And that is like a huge challenge. There's also like huge issues with doing OKRs, in that it's like some version of like Goodhart's law, where like when your measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Whereas like these different levels of the organization can over optimize for some like arbitrary metric that they need to get a promotion, which sometimes that can be aligned with the organization, but like in quickly changing environments, it can become quickly not aligned with what the organization actually needs. So there's like a lot of pushback for OKRs right now. It's unclear, like, I think there's probably some formulation of OKRs that's more dynamic and more responsive to bottom-up stimuli, but they can be really hard to operationalize. But theoretically, amazing way of connecting different levels of the organization. Jesus Christ. All right, different levels of the organization. All right, let's go to the next one, collaborative intelligence. All right, so the drive for self-organizing mechanisms gradually moved from employee empowerment and collective intelligence in form of crowdsourcing, deploying the generative power of information technologies to tap into the collective knowledge base. To collaborative intelligence, CQ, emphasizing the need for a shift in the leadership model from having all the answers to raising the right questions, as digital tools are increasingly deployed to enable goal-directed intelligence deliberations and distributed multi-intelligence systems. And so, like, to think about like what this actually means, like in practice, oftentimes it's not the case where it's like you have some like really huge, robust system where every person in the organization is like seamlessly sharing like their insights and their data. Like that's not really how it works. It much more works that it's like you have specialized sense makers within the organization and consistent ways of processing data and sharing that data. So for example, you'll have like an IT team, they create, they have like a central data warehouse where they put all the data together, they clean it and sanitize it in a consistent way. And then you have embedded kind of sense makers, like kind of consultants or analysts at different levels of the organization, processing that data, sharing insights with each other, socializing across the organization. And that tends to be kind of like how it's generally structured, especially in like a lot of tech companies. All right, an open strategy is kind of an extension of that. It's like the extreme extension of collaborative intelligence. So open strategy is categorically different from traditional top level strategizing and qualitatively different from bottom-up strategizing. So open strategy is unique in its overall transparency, wide inclusiveness, and central use of social IT to effectively enable mass participation. In summary, open strategy is rather project-centric rather than a coherent new strategy governance framework. The very limitations transpiring through the various case studies suggest that open strategy is likely to battle with Schwarmer's three enemies or inner voices of resistance, the voice of judgment, the voice of cynicism, and the voice of fear. So like open strategy is this kind of idea where it's like, the strategy can emerge through this kind of like bottoms up information processing. If we all had the information available to us, it wouldn't be purely on top-down decision maker for like synthesizing all of this, but rather we could all do that together and something more robust will emerge through that process. And this is like especially a popular concept in like among like teal organizations or holacracy, that kind of decision making is like the gold standard for how it should happen. Though like he brought some interesting use cases about things like IBM, things Pepsi, a few other different use cases where their experience with this is mixed. And when he says this is a project centric rather than a coherent new strategy governance framework, like it's easy to do this more in a project setting because you can think about what the relevant pieces of information are and who all the stakeholders are that you want to involve. But to do that dynamically means that you're like continuously bringing in new information, changing in new stakeholders, finding new decision-making processes between those stakeholders. That's super hard to do like on a continuous basis rather than like a limited scope project basis. So it's like a kind of unclear how to make open strategy work over like a long indefinite period of time. Yeah, and Blue, Daniel, anything to add here? Yeah, I mean, just like one last point here is that like I really like how I brought up the voice of the inner voices of resistance, the voice of judgment, the voice of cynicism, and the voice of fear. And that's like really been kind of this feeling I've had as I've been reading this book of like, yes, like this way of integrating top down and bottoms up stimuli together, like sounds great and it's like totally the right way to do it. But sometimes the reality of being an organization is that you're dealing with people's like personal fear. And that really holds you back from being able to like dynamically change. Like people want stability, people want mastery, People want things to be the way that they were the same in the past. And like, that's like a very deeply, I think, human thing. I'm not sure if that's something that's, unique about modern organizations. And like, you're really going up against that when you're trying to develop these more like dynamic systems of thinking about purpose and meaning and sense making. And to me, in my mind, that feels like the central challenge of free energy governance. I'm not sure if John would agree with that, but that to me, that feels like the huge hurdle you have to overcome.
Cool. So moving into the second section, which is much smaller, so we'll try to be fast. Okay, there's a claim here. Strategic renewal is an iterative process of belief, action, and learning, where periods of incremental adjustment, single loop learning, are broken by bursts of revolutionary change, double loop learning. It is only when we start expressing beliefs as probability distributions and action as a state that precedes perception, conditioned by a Markovian boundary intermediating the internal and external states, all dedicated in circular causality to continuously optimizing the updating of beliefs, i.e. learning, a mathematically self-consistent model emerges. So strategic renewal Bijan is using a definition put forward in this article by Schmidt in 2018. This book adopts a cross-hierarchical, capabilities-driven, and action-centric learning perspective in defining strategic renewal, which is best captured by Schmidt. Strategic renewal involves a transformation of the firm's core capabilities associated with competitive advantage, concerns the entire organization, and has implications across organizational levels, and is essential to break path dependence and ensure the firm's long-term survival. And another claim he makes here is to approach strategic renewal as an upper echelon-centric, top-down only challenge is nonsense. Given the importance of social interactions to knowledge development and organizational learning, we believe that renewal can be understood best as a system of relational or social exchanges, which is effectively the essence of reality construction. Indeed, once strategic renewal is embraced as a system of relational or social exchanges, the need for a cross-hierarchical connect emerges. And I just wanted to bring up this figure. This is like the action perception loop from Thinking Through Other Minds, a variational approach to cognition and culture. We've had this on the live stream before. I can't remember and didn't look up which live stream number it was. But in this paper, they really illustrate how this relational and social exchanges, like interaction with the niche environment, helps us come to a mutual consensus in a social kind of way. And so if you would like more information there, I recommend this paper. Okay, and then Bijan talks about top-down versus bottom-up strategic renewal. The more dominant a top-down directed, induced, rather than bottom-up inspired autonomous strategic renewal process, the more likely that critical intelligence from resource markets, maybe that should be from resource markets, is ignored and transient and transformation-bearing market signals are lost. In the absence of a circular top-down, bottom-up organizational learning, the firm may become trapped in top leadership's dominant logics, highly dependent on M&A, joint venture-driven innovation, and increasingly disconnected from the very intelligence the firm's field close to resource markets beholds. Eventually, financial control, M&A, and alliancing is likely to squeeze out strategic control, in-house innovation, making the firm potentially rather more than less vulnerable to survival risk as innovation can no longer can be generated from within the firm. Did you guys have any comments here? Top-down versus bottom-up? And financial versus strategic control. Tyler, do you want to read this one for me?
Sure. Financial and strategic control, respectively, correlate curvilinearly to firm performance. Too little or too much of one or the other is potentially entropy bound. The firm is challenged to find an optimal balance between external and internal innovation to power continuous strategic renewal as a sustainable foundation for firm performance and survival. Indeed, the question arises, how to best balance financial and strategic control, and whether the board of directors potentially assumes a critical and unique strategic role in the process. So yeah, I mean, I think just something to add here too is like a lot of times it's framed as build or buy, and the traditional startup wisdom of like how you might balance these two decisions of like build versus buy, as that like build is, we call that strategic, right? Like these are the things that are like the core and central to your purpose. This is like the core like engine of how you create value in the world. And buy are the things where, and buy can mean a couple of different things. It doesn't actually mean necessarily, it can mean more like partnerships and plugging into the external ecosystem. And so that'd be like using someone else's API for something that is not necessarily central to you, like Stripe payment processing, right? And so it's this way that you can like both have the sustainable competitive advantage while at the same time kind of not using your resources and your energy and your attention for something that's like not core to who you are.
Cool, thank you. Okay, I think this is our final claim from the book. Strategic renewal research is in need of a more comprehensive framework, structurally resolving the hierarchical top-down, bottom-up learning disconnect, cognitively embracing environment as a matter of enactment, and in terms of capabilities, balancing financial and strategic control, as well as exploitation and exploration. The board of directors should be integrated as a distinct cognitive variable into the community of interactions. But more importantly, the question arises whether the board possesses the right capabilities to be of strategic relevance in discontinuous market environments. I think that that's all. So if you guys have any comments, if not, we can move into some concluding thoughts.
Sure. Well, the book is subtitled Reframing the Strategy Governance Conversation. So I think we're getting chapter by chapter a clear review of the positioning and the contribution of free energy governance. And towards the middle of the book, things get really detailed with respect to the applications of the active inference framework. So far, we've seen more of a introductory opening salvo and a call for need for integration above and beyond the current existing practices, which I think Tyler did a great job conveying like some of the real world strengths and weaknesses and challenges of all these different strategies.
Yeah, and just to add to that, like I'm really excited for how we move this into an applied setting, because kind of like, you know, combining the fox and the hedgehog model, like this is something I've actually thought about a lot to little success. And it's a huge problem, especially thinking about like things like OKRs, how quickly they become updated. Like how do you create a model of the world while simultaneously communicating like, hey, this model is subject to change. Like this is a work in progress that we're co-creating together. And like kind of going against people's individual resistance of not wanting change and wanting things to be stable. Like I don't have a clue of how you actually really do that. I'm curious. I really hope Bijan has a good answer for that.
Awesome. Well, we'll see you guys next week for chapter 3. Peace and enjoy your rest of your day or night, wherever you might be in your temporal existence.